Hi, my name is Ricia Weiner. I'm a school psychologist in Arlington Public Schools, and I'm here with my colleagues Eleanor Lewis and Veronica Valdez to do a presentation called Talking with Kids About Racism and Discrimination. During this presentation, you're going to learn several tips and tools to help foster these conversations with your kids. During this presentation, you're going to see several discussion slides that will pop up. When you see those slides, please take time to pause and reflect as we move forward. I'd also like to say that this presentation cannot be taught value-free. We're going to be bringing our shared experiences and just the things we've gone through as people of color in this world. So with that, I'd like to start with our origin stories. So again, my name is Ricia Weiner. And I am a school psychologist in Arlington Public Schools, where I have been for a long time. And I consider myself half Black and half white. My father is white. My mother is Black. I grew up in Arizona. I have two children, a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old. My son is 10, my daughter's 13, and my husband, who would categorize himself as African American. Interestingly, my children, depending on the day, may tell you that they're Black, or they might tell you that they're multiracial. And that is because they know their grandfather very well. They see him, he's part of our lives, as well as my mother. And so those are the experiences that I bring to the table. So I pass it on to my colleague, Eleanor Lewis.
Thank you, Ricia. Again, my name is Eleanor Lewis. I, as well, am a school psychologist with Arlington Public Schools. I was born and raised right next door in Alexandria, Virginia. Again, I come from a predominantly African-American family, and I come to this work, again, with experiences as a daughter, as a sister, as a mother, as a wife. And I also, I think, some of the experiences that kind of have formed my views around this is growing up, especially in high school and college, maybe being the only or one of the only people of color in classes, especially as I got to graduate school. So I bring kind of that perspective and those experiences to this work. And I'll pass it to Veronica.
Thank you, Eleanor. My name is Veronica Valdez. I'm also a school psychologist. I am the daughter of immigrants from Central and South America and first generation born US. I do identify as multiracial because I know the history of where my parents are from, but I do mostly identify myself by my ethnicity, which is Latina. I grew up in Arlington in a predominantly African-American neighborhood with a lot of history. For many, many years, my family was the only non-Black family in the neighborhood. I am a product of Arlington Public Schools. In my elementary days, I do remember there being a lot of busing of kids from my neighborhood to one of the 3 high schools in Arlington to diversify those schools. My exposure to non-people of color or whites really occurred at school or my parents' jobs. I did grow up seeing and hearing and feeling or being exposed to the biases that are placed on immigrants and their children. I was always an avid reader, and it wasn't until 8th grade that I recall a African-American teacher really pushing me to sign up for advanced classes as I transitioned into high school. And doing this, when I did get to high school, I was able to actually meet more people who were not people of color, having joined those classes. And I really think that just my experience in Arlington and having grown up here does bring me, allow me to have a unique perspective of where we've been, where we're going, and things we still need to accomplish.
So some guidelines for our discussion. Again, this is a heavy topic, and But we ask you, as you're thinking about this topic, and as we share some of the tips and points, we want you to, again, try to see this as a brave space. This may be your first time kind of thinking about these topics. You might be here to learn some new tricks, but we want you to, again, be brave in thinking about racism and discrimination. You know, sometimes it may feel like you want to retreat, but we're going to ask you to kind of sit with that discomfort and sit with your thoughts as we're going through the process. Some of these guidelines are more for, again, when we have a live group and we're breaking out in discussion. So confidentiality is important when we're talking about our own experiences and not necessarily sharing others' names or others' experiences. Be open-minded to the process. This is a chance for you to learn and grow, but also being realistic in where we are in this country with racism and discrimination and biases. So be open to hearing a new strategy or a new way to look at a situation. And then, again, this is a journey. There's no end point necessarily in learning these skills and addressing this topic, but we ask you to be okay with the fact that you may leave this discussion with more questions than you came in with, and that's okay.
So in this slide, a similar slide to this often gets shown in conversations around racism and discrimination. And typically that slide ends with equity. And so we strive for equity in that everybody gets what they need. You can see there the two ladders. One of the people's ladders is a bit taller so that they can reach the apples of the tree. So it's that people get these customized tools to get what they need. But I'm going to ask that we all think about aspiring to something higher, and that would be justice, and that the system is actually fixed so that all people get what they need, get equal access, so that they don't have to customize tools. And to me, justice also means that everyone gets a say in those tools and those opportunities, so that it's not one group deciding what tools and opportunities might be best for everyone, but that everyone gets a say in the resources that are created and how they get distributed. So justice is this higher aspiration that we're asking you to think about tonight.
So as we've brought this information together, we've kind of created this framework that we want you to work from, and it's our PIP framework. The first P standing for the personal. What are you doing kind of in your personal life to learn, grow? You're here tonight, or you're reviewing this. So getting that information, and that information can be gleaned from several sources. There are lots of books out, podcasts, also conversations that you're having with your colleagues, your friends, your family members, and checking and challenging kind of the biases that you may be coming to these conversations with. So that's the personal piece in our PIP framework. The institutional piece, again, really trying to identify and acknowledge and identify the systems that create inequities among groups of people. And a lot of times when we think about kind of attacking this issue institutionally, it seems like a kind of heavy and maybe something that seems like it's overwhelming. But really, we're asking you to kind of look at the institutions that you engage with in your life. It may be your PTAs, it may be your homeowners association, and really kind of examining those institutions and looking at what biases or what inequities may be there. And I'll give an example kind of an institution, an attempt to address kind of an institutional inequity that I saw. So I think it was in the summer of 2017. I was going to Williamsburg, Virginia for a training. And I I thought, oh, this would be a great opportunity to take my family, you know, get some history of Virginia and the country. And my daughter was really big into Hamilton at that time. So I was like, oh, this would be great. And so we get to our hotel room and we're looking, you know, what outside of my training, you know, what are we going to go explore? How are we going to explore Williamsburg? And we're looking at a brochure, and it's describing one of the attractions there in Williamsburg. And, you know, the description of African Americans who were enslaved was something to the effect of transported Africans. And, you know, that really took me aback, and it really was, I think, a cleansing of our history that I thought was inappropriate. And so, needless to say, a nicely crafted letter was written to the Historical Association in that area. And so, again, that was my attempt to say, no, this is not an accurate portrayal of what happened in our history. And so let's try to be accurate about what has happened, because that will allow us to really understand and know our history and move forward. But tonight, again, our focus is really on our third P in the PIP framework, which is, you know, addressing your child's questions, assumptions, and actions as a parent. So in order to do this, again, we are helping, hopefully this presentation is helping you help your children to recognize and think critically about racism and systems of oppression, really understanding that this is a reality. These things exist. And so we want to acknowledge that and give children the ability to acknowledge that. We also want to help you provide tools so that your children feel empowered to question and challenge the status quo if necessary. We want them to, again, address their interpersonal interactions in a way that's appropriate and is not, you know, continuing this system of racism and oppression. And we also, this is a process to help your children build that strong foundation of being kind of an anti-racist, really understanding that people need to be treated, again, not just equitably, but justly. And again, this is the process of helping you help your children build that foundation. So you showed up, you have the questions of how and when to do this. And the reality is you probably need to start before you feel ready. This slide shows some of the progression of how students or children start to notice difference. So even as tiny as 3 months, research has shown that babies will, you know, gaze more at a face that is the same as their caregiver, and that is appropriate, and it makes sense, right? If they are exposed to a certain race, they're going to show that preference, and that showing that awareness is not necessarily a problem. It's when, and again, and we'll see this progression as I go through some of these other points, but it's when seeing that difference is superimposed on the biases that are superimposed on those differences. That's when it starts to become a problem. But again, 3 months, children are noticing the differences and showing a preference for individuals who are the same race as their caregivers. At around 30 months, so just shy of 3 years, most kids will select their playmates based on racial, you know, differences. Again, that's probably related to exposure and not a problem in and of itself. Where we start to see a problem is about 4 and 5. That's when kids are really starting to take in the kind of biases and discrimination that that exist in adults. So they're starting to understand and maybe repeat some of that behavior or the biases that they're exposed to. The good news is, and I want to kind of stick to the last research point here, is that, again, children between 5 and 7, if we are explicit and if we are proactive in encouraging interracial friendships and talking about interracial friendships, the research shows that biases and racial attitudes can be changed within a week. And so that's the good news. The reality is this is work, this is active work, but if we do the work, we can change attitudes and change outcomes.
So we looked at a couple of pieces of research that happened. This first study was in 2007, and what it shows us is about 45% of families with kindergartners reported that they'd almost never discuss race issues with their children. This happens to be more prevalent in white families, where 75% of white parents never or almost never talk about race. And in non-white families, it was 3 times more likely that they would discuss race than white parents. This is really important because you as a parent, this is your opportunity to craft that script for your child. As Eleanor stated, kids are soaking things up from their environment. They're getting those messages from all over the place, media, other kids, other adults in their lives, or sometimes they simply are making up what they think might go fill in the space between what they know and what they're wondering about. So this is where sometimes you'll hear kids say, well, brown kids must drink milk that comes from brown cows, or something like that, because without good information, they tend to make up things to help these details fit so that they can understand their world. So noticing differences is not racism. Okay, so when kids notice differences between maybe themselves and another playmate or between groups, that's not racism. That's just simply noticing differences. The issues come in when kids or adults or anyone really starts to ascribe meaning to those differences, placing values, superiority versus inferiority. And so you as a parent, this is your opportunity to craft that and to really shape how kids interpret their world. We wanted to look, because 2007 was quite a while ago, even though this particular data point has been well researched and replicated, we wanted to look at something a little more current. So today, 2020. And what we found was a particular survey that looked at about 2,000 adults, 18 and older. And this was done during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement across 4 major cities. And what they found was 65% of more than 2,000 adults that were surveyed at this time said that their parents had never or rarely had conversations with them about racism when they were children. So you can see there again in those statistics, it holds true that white families tend to speak less about this, families of color tend to speak more, but definitely not all families are talking about this. So we're so happy that you're here, that you're wanting to tackle this issue, because it's extremely important, as this data shows, and as the studies that Eleanor covered in the previous slide, that you as a parent take an active role in talking to your children about racism and discrimination, age appropriate, of course, and are crafting that script and influencing how your children think about these differences.
So here we want to talk a little bit about the why. Why don't parents talk with their children about racism and discrimination? And if you can figure out sort of the why in your own personal life, it will help you in moving to that transition to start having these conversations. One reason certainly may be that there's worry that if racism is talked about, it will be like, again, encouraging those racial biases, seeing those differences. Some parents may really not be sure of what they should be saying. This whole topic really does bring also a lot of strong emotions with it. There may be fear or discomfort about what our kids might say or what others may say to us, even within our own families, if we start talking about this topic. That discomfort, however, does, allow kids to see race as a topic of taboo if we don't talk about it. And by not talking about it, then they are more at risk at inheriting that social and systemic racism that surrounds us. Parents may feel more comfortable, rather than talking about racism, teaching kids to be colorblind and seeing people for who they are. And that's a very common strategy. That's a very common response, particularly by white families. And there's definitely good intentions there. But by using that strategy of being colorblind, it does ignore the reality of systemic racism. And it's very much a way of saying, I don't see color, so the problem cannot be about race, and very much a way of ending the conversation when it could potentially be about race and or discrimination. So it's better as a parent that we help them focus on what is so important and that they get their understanding from you and their values from you on how you see racism. So this leads to our first reflection activity. And here, we're just going to ask you to think about a time that you talked, successfully or not, or wanted to talk about racism and discrimination with your child. Earlier, Eleanor did talk about how early children begin to notice race, and studies show that by age 10, kids are already recognizing all those discriminatory actions, whether they're direct or, things like name calling or something a little bit more covert, like being suspected of doing something wrong. Some of you may have or be familiar with the doll study. If you're not, very briefly, in the 1940s, two psychologists by the name of Dr. Kenneth and Mamie Clark did these doll tests to study the psychological effects of segregation on African American children. They assessed these children between the ages of 3 and 7 by asking them to identify the race of two dolls. One was white and one was black, and asking them which one they prefer. They also asked the children which doll had the more favorable positive characteristics. So things like which one is smart, which one is the nice one, as well as asking them about, negative characteristics, which is the bad one, things like that. And what Dr. Clark's study did conclude was that prejudice and discrimination and segregation was creating a feeling of inferiority for African American children, and most definitely impacting their self-esteem. And this study was so important, it was used in the Brown versus Board education landmark decision, which changed our school system. And one of the things, though, that Dr. Clark did feel that was left out in those concluding remarks in regards to that case was that the study also showed that not only were African American children being impacted, but also white children were being impacted, as well as the fact that racism in America was inherent in sort of who we are as a nation. Here's a clip of a similar study about 10 years ago, but you're going to find that the findings very much still hold.
Anderson Cooper, AC 360, CNN weeknights 10 Eastern.
There are lots of different colors for skin.
I have questions for you about these pictures of different children.
After I read the question, I want you to
Point to the picture that fits the story.
Are children colorblind in America?
show me the smart child.
Show me the mean child.
Can you show me the dumb child?
Show me the nice child.
Is bias measurable even at an early age?
Why is she the bad child?
Because she's black.
And why is he the ugly child?
Because he looks like he's white.
Why is he the dumb child?
Because she has dark brown skin.
Why is she the bad child?
Because she makes fun of everybody else's skin color.
How much do kids learn from what they see and hear from adults?
Show me the child who has the skin color most adults like.
And show me the child who has the skin color most adults don't like.
These are questions that we, along with CNN's Soledad O'Brien and a team of psychologists hired by CNN, spent months investigating through tests, interviews with children and their parents. But they're questions that have been asked for decades. The first doll study ignited controversy in the 1940s when psychologist Kenneth and Mamie Clark pioneered studies in the effects of segregation in schools by asking African American kids to choose between black and white dolls. The so-called doll test found black kids overwhelmingly preferred white over black. Those results were at the center of the landmark 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, that desegregated American schools. Now, with the first African-American president and nearly 60 years after segregation was overturned, we wondered, where are we today? How do kids see differences in race? What we discovered might shock you, but first, how we got there.
Skin color, child skin color estimate.
Okay, yeah.
We asked renowned child psychologist and University of Chicago researcher Dr. Margaret Beal Spencer to design a pilot study for CNN and analyze the results.
Our children are always near us, because we're a society. And what we put out there, kids report back. You ask the question, they'll give you the answer.
Spencer's team tested more than 130 kids in 8 schools with very different racial and economic demographics. Half of the schools were in the north, half in the south. Oh, nicely done. The country is much more diverse today than in the 1940s. The children in this project are from 2 age groups and 2 races, white and black, to better allow comparison to the original doll study. 4- and 5-year-old children were asked a series of questions about these images. 9- and 10-year-old children were asked questions about the same images, as well as this color bar chart. The tests led us to 3 major findings. First, white children as a whole responded with a high rate of what researchers call white bias, identifying the color of their own skin with positive attributes and darker skin with negative attributes.
Show me the dumb child.
Dumb child.
Okay, why is she the dumb child?
Because she has black skin.
Show me the mean child. Why is he the mean child?
Because she's brown.
Show me the bad child. Why is he the bad child?
Because she is black.
Okay. Show me the ugly child. Why is he the ugly child?
Because she's brown, black.
Show me the child who has the skin color most adults like. And show me the child who has the skin color most adults don't like. Show me the child who has the skin color most children like. Show me the child who has the skin color most children don't like. Show me the child who has the skin color most girls want. Show me the child who has the skin color most girls don't want.
The questions that got overwhelmingly white biased answers?
Show me the dumb child.
About 76% of the younger white children pointed to the 2 darkest skin tones.
Show me the mean child.
About 66% of the younger white children pointed to the 2 darkest skin tones.
Show me the child who has the skin color most children don't like.
Again, about 66% of the younger white children pointed to the 2 darkest skin tones.
Show me the bad child.
More than 59% of the older white children pointed to the 2 darkest skin tones. But some white children did have more race-neutral responses.
So could you show me the good-looking child? So what are you thinking? I know you pointed to them all, but tell me what you're thinking.
I'm thinking that I do not care if they are black, white, mixed, or any kind of race. I think that it matters who they really are.
Anderson Cooper.
So as you can see in that study that was done originally in the 40s, a lot of that was still holds today. So it is really important to think about the environment and the messages that our kids are getting. How bias can play out. There is a study that came out recently in 2020 that showed that Black adolescents experience an average of 5 discriminatory encounters every day, either online or in person. Those encounters can come in many shapes and forms. They could be covert, or they could be more sort of in your face. But one of the ways that sort of more covert or insidious discriminatory encounters can take place is through something called microaggressions. And I'm going to go ahead and read the definition for microaggressions. And it's a term that was coined by a Harvard professor and psychiatrist. His name was Chester M. Pierce in the 1970s. And some of you may know that another researcher, Daryl Wing Su, did a lot of work around microaggressions more recently, and really helped push this term into our current day vernacular. So microaggressions is a term that we often hear out there now. So I'm going to read the definition because I want to make sure that we really spend some time thinking about this and really understanding what it is. So microaggressions are brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes towards stigmatized or culturally marginalized groups. And so what we know is when kids hold onto some of these biases, or they come into their psyche in some way, these get played out in their interactions, in their interpersonal interactions. And so in this next slide, what we're going to see is an example of how these biases can sort of infiltrate these interactions between kids. And unfortunately, we can't be there all the time to monitor these interactions. This is what, again, why it's vitally important that we are having these conversations with our kids. So to set this up a little bit, this particular clip is taken from this is a group online. They're called Hi Ho Kids. They often just put kids together in groups and give them an activity and then videotape. And, you know, kids are funny when they get together. Sometimes you can't predict what they're going to do or say. And so this particular group is not setting out to record kids making microaggressions or doing racist or discriminatory things. This is really just a fun thing to record kids and see how cute they can be when they get into groups. However, the setup is these girls are together for a tea party, and this is just a tiny 9-second clip of this interaction that happens during this tea party. And for me, one of the things to really think about is how the little Black girl reacts at the end of this.
I had a math test. How was your math test? Got an F? Or an A? Or a B or C? I got an A. Good job.
Who's ready for the second course?
And as you can see there, when they ask for who's ready for the second course, the little Black girl is the last one to raise her hand. Kind of, it just, to me, feels like she's thinking about what just happened.
So again, I think the overview of the doll studies, as well as that little clip that we just watched, shows us that it's not that it would be nice to talk about racism and discrimination, but we must do this. We must do this work if we are intent on moving from that equity to a more just society. So first, you as parents, you are your children's first teacher. And Ricia alluded to this earlier, you know, you want to craft the message, because kids not only say the darndest thing, they believe the darndest thing, and they are very impressionable at a young age. And so if you are a family who really is want to move this topic forward and want to really, if your belief system is grounded in an anti-racist viewpoint, you really have to craft that message, and you have to give it to your children often. You don't want to overdo it, but you really do want to make sure that they are understanding that your approach is that all people should be treated justly and not based on their race. And so again, that's an active, this is an active parenting approach. Again, we are educators, and so we believe most things can be taught, and this can be taught as well. It has to be taught because, as we saw in that the clip between the children at the tea party, we cannot be there to mediate every interaction. And so we are teaching this to our children, and so that hopefully, you know, and ideally in that tea party situation, those two little girls who were the observers would have said something or stood up or, you know, said, oh, that wasn't right to assume that she got an F. So that's what we're working towards, kids who can recognize when an injustice occurs and intervene in an appropriate way. In this teaching about racism and diversity and discrimination, we want to provide accurate knowledge and information to our kids. We want to encourage, you know, pride about their own racial and cultural identity and background. We want to encourage appreciation of others, and that goes beyond kind of surface level appreciation, but really understanding kind of the basic human rights of all people. We want to help children understand how racism works in this country. As Veronica said, it's the research has shown it's embedded in who we are as a country. And so understanding those different levels of racism, the institutionalized or systemic racism, the personally mediated when we're interacting with others, how is racism playing or not playing in those interactions, and also the internalized. We are exposed to a lot of media and outside influences, and to realize that those influences or those subliminal images or influences really impact how we see others. And again, the doll study kind of supports that as well. It's not that someone's overtly teaching children that the dark-skinned person is the bad person, but the influences that we see on an everyday basis would make, you know, children, adults, make that assumption or make that correlation. Again, this is vitally important because we want to remove the stigma of talking about racism. For a long time, you know, everyone shied away. We don't talk about that. That's not appropriate. But the reality is we need to talk about it, and we need to be action oriented if we want to affect change. Silence only reinforces racism. It only reinforces the negative influences and biases that we are exposed to. So, you know, polite silence is not going to help us move towards a more just society. We have to talk about it, remove the stigma, and be realistic about our history and how we want to move forward.
So just as Eleanor was saying, we want to remind you that avoiding or ignoring that conversation will leave children exposed to developing those biases. So here we have just some tips to get you started on how to approach the topic of racism and discrimination. And if you recall from several slides back in terms of the why we aren't having these conversations, one of those important things is to be aware of your own biases. So we're going to ask you to be courageous If you are afraid of people of color, or if you live in an all-white neighborhood with little exposure to people of color, children will notice that. They'll notice your body language. They'll notice if you driving in a neighborhood and then all of a sudden you lock your car doors. Those are things that children will notice, and they will remember it. This will kind of instill those biases in a subtle way. And again, kids will tend to start to show a preference for whiteness if this is the type of sort of messages that they're receiving. Again, even if they're not, explicit. We are going to ask you to, look at those teachable moments. That may be a time that you want to approach the subject. And those moments should certainly be age appropriate. If your child points to someone that may look different, that may be an opportunity to talk to your child about it. Get an understanding of why they're pointing rather than, shushing them and asking them to be quiet. That right there, again, could be an opportunity to correct a misperception. For younger kids, a way to approach the subject may be through picture books. If you're reading a particular favorite story, you can make a comment about who the people in the book are. Are they all white? Maybe asking, like, what do you think about if, the characters here in this book of Frozen are Black or Latino, or if they were Asian. If you are reading a book that does have diverse characters in it, you may ask them about what they want to be. You could identify and point out the positive qualities in a person of color in the book. And again, those may be examples of countering those biases that they may have been exposed to. Remember, the goal is to start understanding where your children are coming from when they give you their responses. We've said this several times throughout the presentation. You never know what kids are going to say, but again, that's giving you that framework of understanding where they may be coming from. With older children and with teens, they certainly can talk more about their feelings. They're much more exposed to information. They're tapping into that abstract thinking. So talk about the media. Talk about what they're reading. What do they think? Talk about what's going on at school. What are they seeing in movies? Explore stereotypes together. Ask questions. What do you think about, why Black men face more stricter sentences than their young white counterparts? Or what do you think about how Latinos or Asians are portrayed in media? Those are ways to kind of, start those conversations. And certainly social media is a big source of information. Ask them about, some of what they may be reading on that. You can, engage and even encourage some online activism, Ultimately, we want you to also think about expanding their knowledge of people of color and other marginalized groups, as well as ethnically and diverse people, through books, through museums, through podcasts. There's certainly a plethora of information. We want you to look beyond the white narrative of history to start to expand their ideas of how racism and discrimination has been part of our history, not just in the US, but also worldwide. This can give perspective, and through perspective, you gain knowledge of certain subjects that may be, certainly discussed in the media. For example, if you talk about how white societies have played a role or impacted the economy and opportunities and lives of Latin American countries, then you can gain some perspective on immigration. And certainly looking at history is very painful, but we've gotten into a pattern of ignoring it for so long that it's a cycle, or not just ignoring it, but changing it a bit, similar to Eleanor's example of going to Williamsburg and the use of the word transported Africans. So it's definitely, we have to look at that history, and for me, that's very much an important part of looking and having these conversations with our children. So this leads us to our second reflection. So this is called the triangular stare. A passerby stops to look at your family. Their gaze goes from one parent to the other, to the child and back. And your family, let's say, happens to be multiracial. It could be transracial, it could be through adoption, it could be a blended family, an interracial union. What's your initial reaction? What's your child thinking? And what do you do? So here we'll talk a little bit about handling incidents of racism. If your child is responsible for the incident of racism or the recipient of a racist action, in either situation, we would encourage you to let them talk about their feelings they have about themselves, how others look, about others who don't look like them, right? Ask your child, well, what did those words mean to them? Where did they learn them? Or how do they think those words may make others feel, right? We will ask you to be calm, but don't hide your emotions. The subject is too important on whichever end you are. If your child is the one that said something and they tell you something about, oh, Black people, they're always bad, they're, think about sort of where that idea is coming from. A good response may be from you to emphasize that, well, Black people are good, and being Black or having Black skin doesn't make you bad. And talking about the idea of treating people unfairly is what's bad. And then even going further and saying that, Blacks have been treated unfairly for a long time. So bringing in that perspective, and it's not related to the skin color that makes somebody bad. It's the treatment, the history there of that. If your child is the recipient, acknowledge their upset, but this can also be very traumatic for them. And you may want to check in with your child and your own mental health and rely on your support systems, your friends, your family, church, your own mental health professionals that may work with your family you may know, especially if you are a family of color that likely experience that bias or that prejudice. And certainly to see your child experiencing that now is very painful and traumatic. Think about, your experiences in those issues, and recognize that, this is a time that I can help my child clarify what values I want them to have and what behaviors I want them to demonstrate. You want your child to know that there are federal civil rights laws that protect them from hate speech and violence and bullying. And the conversation is good even as, the parent of a child who may have something racist or involved in that, right? We want to start to say, we're going to deal with this proactively. This does lead us to our third reflection, which Ricia will go over.
All right, so as Veronica talked about in the last slide, sometimes it happens that your child might be the one testing out some of these words, and testing out maybe even their power in a situation, which developmentally is what kids do. They test out their powers and their ways to use power in their relationships. And so here's a situation that will help you to think about that. So what would you do? The school called to let you know that your child was part of a group who had been teasing a Muslim child about being a terrorist. What is your initial reaction? What do you think your child is thinking? And what do you do? Okay, so if the situation happens, the first thing that you want to do is to keep calm. It may be against your values as a family, something you feel like you might have talked to your child about. But again, kids were going to test out these words at times, and so it may very well happen. It doesn't mean your child is bad, as Veronica had said earlier. Really, there are good people do things that are not so great, and no one person is all good or all bad. No particular race or ethnic group is all good or all bad. There are just as much diversity. There's just a lot of diversity within a group and even within a person. All right, so keep calm. Don't minimize the situation. So you want to avoid telling your child that they're being oversensitive or imagining something. And these days, people refer to this as gaslighting. So you don't want to tell anybody really, that what they're feeling is invalid. You want to validate those feelings and then move forward. You want your child to know that talking to you is safe, that they can speak frankly with you and openly with you, that they can make mistakes with you. So in that conversation, they may say something that you're like, that does not sound great. This is where you want your children to test it out when they're with you and they can feel safe, and that you can talk about better ways of phrasing something or challenge their thinking. You do want to try to avoid that you're launching into an inquisition when you're gathering information about an incident. And this is particularly important for older kids. So thinking middle school, high school age, that is a surefire way to get your child to shut down. If they feel like they're being interrogated, they may become defensive, they may lash out back at you, or they may just stop talking about the situation altogether. So you have to carefully gather information, but you can also just ask a couple probing questions and let your child lead that conversation as you're gathering information. This last one is also really important, and this can happen for any age group. You can role play or discuss the situation from a new perspective so that your child can work out new ways to handle the situation. This is great with little kids. This is also really great with older kids because it is more likely that a child will stick with the way that they want to handle a situation if they have practiced it beforehand. And actually, this is just a good tip and trick for any situation. It doesn't have to be race or racism or discrimination necessarily. But we know that we're more likely to stick with our good ideas or our good strategy if we practice it ahead of time. So having those conversations, getting a chance to perspective take with, so you're looking at how other people in the situation might view the situation, and then role playing that out to see how you might, how your child might handle themselves if the situation was to come up again. So here's how a discussion about racism can go. You can ask what happened. How did it make you feel? What did you say or do when it happened? This point is really great because here's where you can enter into that role playing or perspective taking. And then asking your child, if something like this happens again, do you think you will deal with it in the same way? And this last one is really important. What would you like me to do something? This is a really important question to ask your child because it helps you to learn how confident they may feel in handling the situation on their own, or if they are reluctant to re-engage in the situation because maybe they're embarrassed or they feel bad or they might be fearful. So it's really good for you to understand where your child's coming from. The one thing you definitely want to do, or don't want to do really, is you don't want to promise that you'll follow what they say. You reserve the right as the adult to make the final decision about whether or not you are going to get involved. I think it's really important, and as you've seen through some of the tips and tools that we've shared, that you want to prepare your child to have these conversations, and you want to build them up so that they feel confident to address racism and discrimination. That's really important, and you want to give them the space to do it, even if they don't always get it right the first time. However, there are situations where you as an adult will need to step in because it is beyond what a child should be feel responsible for doing, or beyond a child's, they may need your backup. So you definitely want to ask your child what they feel like they want you to do, but always reserve the right to step in if needed, because some situations just require an adult intervention. So here's our third, what would you do? Take it away, Eleanor.
Thank you, Ricia. So again, we've had a couple of scenarios / reflection points where we're looking at, an incident where your family is the subject of a racist encounter. We've had the scenario where, again, your child has committed an act of racism. And finally, we want you to take this final reflection point and think about what would you do. So a child directs the N-word at a Black classmate. When the child who was called the N-word confronts the first child, the child claims that they were using it as a term of endearment, a claim that is not explicitly contested by the friend to whom the N-word was directed. Your child relays this story to you over dinner that evening. So again, we've said several times that perspective taking is very important in these discussions. And so we want you to take a few minutes now to think about this scenario. One, from the perspective of your child just being an observer of the situation. And then think about this scenario as if your child were the child who you actually used the N-word. And finally, think about the scenario from the perspective of your child being the one who was called the N-word. Again, what are your initial reactions from those different perspectives? What do you think your child is thinking, and what would you do? So we are coming to our concluding slides. And so we just have some reminders, some do's and don'ts, some things to continue to think about. The first is that there is a reality of racism in this country. So we want you to let your child know that they will encounter racism and discrimination, either as the culprit or the offender, or the one who is on the receiving end. And so, being grounded in the fact that there is a high likelihood that your child will be involved in some way. The second point is that, again, we all make mistakes. We all, have suffered from foot and mouth. And so we want you to let your child know that this is not if they are the offender and happen to do something that would be considered racist, that doesn't make them a bad person. This is a growing and learning process. And so, we want to acknowledge when we do make those mistakes and work on doing better and growing the next time. And finally, the final point, and as we've done this work over several years, there's no end point. There's not a point where you get, your 30 credits in anti-racism and you can hang your certificate on the wall. This is a lifelong commitment. It's a lifelong journey. There will be times, sometimes it's very hard to actually find the courage to engage in this work. The one thing I will say is that some families, mostly white families, have the privilege of stepping away from this work. Often families of color, this is a continual point of discussion, point of interaction in our families. And, you know, it rises to the level of safety for some of us. And so the reality is, if it becomes overwhelming, or if you need to step away, do that for your own health and well-being, but be committed to come back and re-engage. And so that's the ask that we would make of you. Some tips about do's and don'ts. So as you're thinking of about engaging in these conversations and reflecting yourselves, as I said earlier, things are going to happen. Mistakes will be made. Comments will happen. It's not an indictment or necessarily that you or your children are racist. We want you to lead by example. And that is also the process of self-reflection, examining, you know, what influences that you're letting seep in, and what you're doing to counter that, actively doing to counter that. Responding when you hear something or see something. And again, that response doesn't necessarily have to be immediate. You have to think about, is this a safe time to respond? So it may be that you see something and then you process it later, and your action may come later. But responding when you see or hear something that is clearly inappropriate or racist or discriminatory. And also in the do's, we want you to expose your children to a wide variety of people. And sometimes that's harder to do than we want to acknowledge. You know, our neighborhoods are set up to kind of not be integrated. We've made progress, of course, but if your bubble, if your circle of influence is very homogenous, it's hard to counter some of those social influences. So you have to be active in what you're exposing your children to. And you can do that through literature, through experiences, through, it may be that, again, not joining your neighborhood soccer team, but maybe joining a soccer team that's in a different neighborhood, so that your children can experience others and have those cultural experiences with those who don't look like them. Do not, some of our don'ts in this process. Again, easier said than done, but facing that fear, I don't know that we can say don't be afraid, but be willing to face and sit with the fear of tackling these issues and taking it one step at a time. You know, there's that saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So, you know, taking it and building upon what you're comfortable with, and maybe expanding as you go along. This final point, and I think families of color could probably fall into this trap very easily, but not overdoing it. It's hard because we're coming from a perspective of keeping our children safe. And so, you know, but I have an 11-year-old daughter, and I get the eye roll very often because I'm always asking her to think about what she's consuming and how is that impactful, and how are people of color presented in what she's consuming. And I would venture to say she says I overdo it. But again, finding that balance is important so that the topic is not taboo. It's not something that you don't ever talk about, but it shouldn't be the only thing you talk about either. So finding that balance, I think I'm still on that journey, but I'm going to turn it over to Veronica to discuss this next slide.
So something to think about moving forward. You've heard tips and things to kind of keep in your parent tool belt. We hope at least that this presentation has started you on that journey from being an inclusive parent to an anti-racist parent. And some of you may be already there. Remember, inclusive parents are going to promote that colorblindness idea. We want to start to make that shift into teaching children about race and how it impacts us as a society and a country, and that's anti-racist parenting. That's active parenting. We want you to expand their knowledge of people in color, and really, talking about it's bigger than just celebrating Martin Luther King or recognizing who Rosa Parks is. And those are definitely things and historical figures to know and talk about. But it's so much bigger than that. Getting into the history of people of color all around the world, other marginalized groups. Don't just show children movies like Moana and Princess and the Frog and feel like you're expanding their exposure. You want to also point out examples of racism in media that you see. You also want to point out representation in movies that your children are exposed to. And if you are a family that is white, you want to talk about, your own privileges and not just what that means, right? Earlier, you saw a slide that talked about having an equity mindset, and Ricia, talked to us a little bit about moving not from the equity piece to the justice mindset. And just like that, we want you to move from that parenting style of being an inclusive parent to an anti-racist parent, so that you can prepare your children and make them good change agents.
And with that note, again, we've done this presentation several times, but we always land on this quote from James Baldwin. It was true in the 60s. It's as true today as it was when he wrote it in the 60s, that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So we appreciate you taking the time to review this presentation, knowing that you are attempting to be a change agent in this world. We appreciate your partnership in this work, and we continue along the journey.
So if you want more, we are going to be getting together this spring in March and April of 2021. Dates and times are coming soon, but we will be facilitating conversations, discussion group conversations, where you will have the opportunity to ask questions, discuss your experiences, and get some feedback from the facilitators and other participants. We will be offering a Spanish language facilitated group that will be with Veronica. And so look out for that. That's coming soon. You'll see that through the PRC. And we want to thank the PRC for their partnership in this presentation. So thank you so much for attending. If you'd like to get a hold of us, please, by all means, email us. We are happy to respond if you have additional questions or things that you would like to share. But we hope to see you all soon in one of our discussion groups. So again, thank you so much tonight for your attention and your commitment to this topic and these issues.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.